our talk with HoloArt about the supercomputer, Connection Machine AI Supercomputer. Tomiko was awarded the 2018 SAT Montreal Visionary Pioneer Award for over 35 years of politically and socially critical media artworks exploring place, space, the body, and cultural identity. Thiel was lead product designer on the Connection Machine 1986-1987, the CM-1, CM-2, the first AI supercomputer, and in 1989, the fastest in the world. It influenced Google's AI technology and inspired Steve Jobs' designs, and is in the collections of MoMA New York and the Smithsonian Institution. Her own AI artworks include I Am Sound, 2016 generative audiovisual selfie installation, and Lend Me Your Face, 2022 deepfake video installation. Her first VR work was as producer, creative director of Starbright World 1994-1997, the first metaverse for children with Steven Spielberg. Her own artwork, Beyond Manzanar 2000, was the first VR collected by a U.S. art museum, San Jose Museum of Art 2022. Recent VR works include Land of Cloud 2017. Sorry, go ahead.
The collection was 2002, not 2022.
Oh, I apologize. 2002, slightly dyslexic. Recent VR works include Land of Cloud 2017, Google VR Tilt Brush Artist in Residence, winner of 2018 VRHAM Audience Award, and Atmosfera 2021 for the Moda 4.0 curator Christian Paul. Her first AR art critic, Face Matrix 2010, was a path-breaking intervention into MoMA New York, followed by Shades of Absence AR intervention into the 2011 Venice Biennale. This led to many commissions, including the Whitney Museum, New York, for Unexpected Growth 2018 in the collection, Rewild AR 2021 for the 175th anniversary exhibit of the Smithsonian Institution, and Apothecary's Garden 2021 for the Roche Basel Art Collection. And this one, Tomiko, the Waldo Wandel Forest Flux 2023 for, I'm going to have you pronounce the Munich and Bavarian.
Kunsthalle Munich and the Bayerische Staatsforsten, Bavarian State Forest.
That's right. Thank you so much. We're delighted to have you with us here today. And wow, what a portfolio and incredible body of conceptual and impactful work that you have put together. Delighted and excited. Over to you. Without further ado.
Thank you. Then I'll go directly to share screen. And let's see, select. Wow. Okay. So thank you so much for the invitation. And I want to start out by saying that I did not study artificial intelligence. I do not have a computer science degree. I actually studied engineering, product design engineering, mechanical engineering at Stanford Product Design Program, and then worked as a product design engineer at Hewlett Packard in Silicon Valley for a while, and then went to MIT to get my master's in mechanical engineering, but took fully half of my classes at what was the precursor to the MIT Media Lab before it existed, and decided at that point in 1982 actually that I wanted to become a media artist. But I got distracted when 3 days after I graduated, my friend Danny Hillis, who was an MIT AI Lab PhD student under Marvin Minsky, asked me if I would come to his new startup, Thinking Machines Corporation, that he was creating to build his PhD thesis, the Connection Machine. This was supposed to be a massively parallel supercomputer, the first AI supercomputer with 64,000 simple one-bit processors. He asked me to be the lead product design engineer. He and I were both around 26. Many other staff engineers and scientists were actually younger, although we had a couple of adults who tried to keep us on the straight and narrow. So the machine was built and in 1989 won the Gordon Bell Prize as the fastest supercomputer in the world. The performance, if you want to compare it with technology you might know of today, basically the CM2 was about the level of an iPhone 5, which I'm sure none of you use anymore. So that gives you an idea of what has changed in that time. But it was at one point the fastest computer in the world. So the first year of its existence was at the Robert Treat Paine Mansion, a 19th century mansion in Waltham outside of Boston in Massachusetts. And it was quite an old building. We rewired it for the many very powerful workstations we had. We blew out the circuits frequently during the summer, but that's not why the old fire engine there is standing there. The fire engine is Danny Hillis's private vehicle. So this was a photograph when Marvin Minsky and came up to meet us and investors for a conference at the old house. So the way that Danny got me to agree immediately to come was saying, if you come, you get to work with Richard Feynman. And I had started out as a physics student. I was a total fan of Richard and said immediately, where do I sign? Where do I sign? And indeed, Richard spent his summers with us when he wasn't teaching at Caltech. And this is a photograph showing that in those days we were also pretty soda pop and pizza powered. Richard introduced techniques from physics, such as partial differential equations and quantum annealing, techniques that he used to do his quantum chromodynamics and had probably never been applied to computer design before. The other person sitting at the table there is Brewster Kahle, who you might know now as the founder of the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine. But even at that point, he was, I think, 22 maybe, had just gotten his bachelor's and was a fan of big data and might have even coined that term. So Richard was given the task of designing the message router that would be passing the messages between these 64,000 processors. And Danny told me it's a 12-dimensional Boolean n-cube. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, go ask Richard. And Richard, of course, said, oh, that's easy, and grabbed a piece of paper and a pencil. We were designing a supercomputer with paper and pencil those days, and said that if you take two chips and connect them together, you can consider that a one-dimensional cube. If you take that structure, duplicate it, connect the ends, you have a two-dimensional cube, what we conventionally call the square. If you take that square, duplicate it, connect the edges, you have what looks to us as a normal three-dimensional cube, where each corner of the cube is a single chip with 16 processors on it. So then he said, okay, you duplicate that three-dimensional cube and it's connect the edges, it's a four-dimensional cube. And then he said, the other dimensions are too difficult to draw. It's too complicated. On the other hand, I still had to go up to 12 dimensions. I had to wire this stupid thing. So I tried to figure out, what did it mean? How could I figure it out where every connection on every chip would have to go to in the machine? So I played around again on paper and took the inside cube, put it next to the outside cube. And as long as I'm keeping the connections between the edges, then it doesn't matter. It's topologically the same thing. And when I did that, I realized that what I had now looked very much like a one-dimensional cube. That is to say, a line. And going on, a five-dimensional cube looks very much like a square made out of cubes. And lo and behold, a six-dimensional cube is a cube of cubes. And you can just repeat this endlessly for all the dimensions you want. And so here's what our 12-dimensional cube looked like. And with that, I knew every single connection I had to make. Each processor chip had to connect directly to 12 other chips. And then the pathway, the longest pathway in the machine would be at the most 12 steps from one chip to any other given chip. So this is the reality of what it actually looked like when I got down to doing the cables. But even if it looked complicated, I had this very simple scheme in my mind that that could be used to do not only the hardware, but also the software. And it turns out when it came to having a T-shirt, because of course every startup needs a T-shirt, then Danny and I came up with this logo. So the hard geometric lines represent the hardware, the connections in metal that really can't be changed, but the software connections are independent of that hardware structure, and the software data structures don't have to know what the underlying physical structure of the actual hardware machine is. So this became our Cube of Cubes T-shirt, and we renamed it the Feynman T-shirt in the 90s when Steve Jobs used this photograph of Richard Feynman wearing his CM1 T-shirt as part of the Think Different Apple campaign, which pleased us no end. Richard wore this T-shirt very often. You'll see a lot of recordings of him giving talks with it on. So then it was clear to me that I would be able to fit all of the hardware into a standard 19-inch rack, a standard sort of cabinet. On the other hand, we were a bunch of young kids, and we were up against the old guys, people like Cray, who had the fastest supercomputer at that time, the Cray 1, where Cray had also had kind of a cool design. This was the coolest thing going at that point, very much driven by the hardware requirements of having all the wires the same length, because after all, the speed of light is a constant, and they were up against that barrier. The connection machine, with its massive parallelism, was to jump across that barrier with a completely different design. But if we brought you in and said, hey, this is a machine done by us 25-year-olds that for only 3 to 5 million can be yours, and it's like no machine you've ever seen before. If that customer comes in with this checkbook in his hands and says, oh my God, I just bought a refrigerator that looks exactly like that, you've already lost. So I started looking at images for what did AI represent, what sort of images did AI represent for us. And the strongest one at that time was, unfortunately, a very negative one, HAL, the supercomputer in 2001, The Space Odyssey, who goes berserk and tries to kill his astronauts. So this is the famous scene where the astronaut is lobotomizing HAL by turning off all of his memory banks. So really, computer as Frankenstein monster. In the AI community, though, there were also very positive examples of imagery for AI. For instance, Stanislav Lem's Golem 14, where he described the Golem 14 as being a computer that took up an entire MIT building. It was like looking down into a volcano caldera. Since I couldn't find any illustrations of this book, I present you here with a photograph of a real volcano caldera. But he says you're looking down on these cryonic cooling tubes topped with a mountain of glass fiber light conductors and Josephson junctions and light sparking between them. And he described the machine as being developed for the military to wage war. But once they turned it on, Golem was much more interested in metaphysical questions of existence, ignored his human masters, and went off to talk to other superintelligences. So this gives you an idea more of the positive nature of what the AI community saw as the potential for AI. The other images that I had in my head were images of, for instance, Arnaldo Pomodoro's sculptures, which seemed to me like entire planets, man-made planets that could harbor entire civilizations. And then actually here another sort of negative image of the Star Wars Death Star, which was exactly that. It was a huge space vehicle that looked remarkably like Arnaldo Pomodoro's sculptures. So this technological image of a massive civilization was also a very compelling image for me when we set out designing the form of the machine. So we hired two designers, Al Hoffman and Gordon Bruce from Elliott Noise Design, to help us ideate and come up with a final form that would really convey the essence of the computer. What I didn't realize at that time was that both of them had actually done concept sketches for for 2001: A Space Odyssey, and had actually worked on the real space station. So that probably explained why we had this sort of common store of imagery in our heads that made it very easy for us to communicate, even though I was coming from an engineering and AI world, and they were coming from a product design, industrial design world. So here's an image on one side, on the left from me, on the other side from them. But basically, at some point, we all drew a cube of cubes, my version on the left, and theirs here on the right. And when we drew those images, we immediately knew this really has to be what it is. So I always say this is the only supercomputer that was designed after a T-shirt. And it really is true, because that T-shirt really communicated all of the important components of the machine. So the question was, okay, we have the hardware cube of cubes, that is these black matte cube of cubes, but if that's all there is, it really is a black box. We wanted to communicate what's happening inside, like those pom-pom balls in the T-shirt design. So what we ended up doing was taking the status lights that are usually right next to each one of these processor chips on the boards, moving them out to the edge of the board and making the doors to the machine translucent. So when the machine is running, you can actually program the lights to do whatever you want. My concept was you should program it so that every chip that was being used should turn its light on, and then you can see how your program is distributed across the entire computer. And indeed, one developer told me the first time they tried to program the machine, the lights in only one cube lit up, and it was immediately clear to them that they had to reprogram to address every single processor chip in the whole machine. So, so just to jump ahead to questions of what contribution did this machine have to AI, to supercomputing, because a lot of websites on the internet say it was a dead end, and completely ignoring the fact that it was the fastest machine of the day, but they said after that it was a dead end. But the sorts of programs we were working on in those early mid-'80s were things like, can the computer, if we give the starting point and end point of a journey, can the computer calculate the path we should take? We are all using this technology in Google Maps. We were also working on full text natural language English search. So instead of saying, okay, I need to understand what keywords somebody has typed in to find this piece of text, I can just type in a sentence like, what year was Google founded? What year was Thinking Machines founded? In my own natural language, and I get an answer, like we do with Google search, all the internet search browsers. Richard Feynman, the crazy physicist who got his Nobel for quantum chromodynamics, was actually doing the first simulations of yet another totally unworkable and crazy idea called quantum computing on the connection machine. And now people talk about building quantum computers and doing quantum computing. Another crazy idea that would never work was neural networks. And it was clear to the scientists at that point that the connection machine could actually only do a very small number of levels. And we had to have many, many more levels, deeper levels, in order for neural networks and machine learning to work. And we had to remember this is mid-1980s. We had to wait until 2012 or so before all that technology was in place. And in terms of questions for the, for the all the ethics, I went back and talked to my friends from that time from the company, and said, do you still believe that AI is creating the next generation? And actually, many of them did, and say either we're creating AI enhanced humans, for instance, a human being walking around with a smartphone that is more powerful than the connection machine is actually an AI enhanced human. And maybe, some people said maybe it will be our evolutionary replacement, as a lot of scare scenarios are being batted around right now. The other thing is that, scientists tend and engineers tend to be very focused on their area of expertise. And so when I said, well, what about the social consequences? Most of them said there will be social consequences, but you know what? That's not my area. I don't know how to deal with that. Other people will have to think about that. And now we come to the situation where, for the last maybe even decade, other people have been trying to think about that, and the companies have usually fired those people. And now it's gotten to a point where we all take it seriously, and even the leaders of those technology companies are saying we've got to have a consensus on how we deal with AI development because it's moving so fast. So a quick update on how this technology lives on. It turns out that Sergey Brin, who co-founded Google, learned his parallel programming on a CM2 when he was an undergraduate. It turns out that the MapReduce algorithm that made Google such a success as a search engine, together with Google's PageRank algorithm, is a further development of the alpha mapping beta reduction techniques that Danny Hillis describes in his thesis book, The Connection Machine. And it turns out that after the thinking machines went bankrupt in the mid-90s, when the end of the Cold War ended funding for supercomputers, that Danny started a company called MetaWeb, together with some people, including John Gianandrea, to do semantic network programming. So to speak, quote unquote, understanding the relationships between entities, between concepts, between words, between objects. In 2010, they sold this technology to Google, and John Gianandrea went to become head of AI at Google. In 2018, he went on to become head of AI at Apple. But Google is really the pathway through which the technology, hardware and software, developed at thinking machines for the connection machine, flowed into Google and is being further developed today. And I'm happy to say there was also a legacy in the design field. A good friend of mine back when I was working in Silicon Valley was Joanna Hoffman. I didn't realize at that point she was working on the very first Macintosh. It was a secret. She told me only in 1982 that soon a computer would come out that was tiny, but a computer by itself. That was the first Macintosh in 1984. Joanna went to Next Computer with Steve Jobs when they threw Steve Jobs out of Apple. And years later, Joanna told me in 1986, they were starting work on the design of the next computer. And Steve Jobs said to her, find me the person who did the connection machine. I've just seen it. I want that person to design my next computer. And Joanna looked at him and said, I'm sorry, but Tomiko's moved off to Europe to become an art student, and I have no contact information for her. So that little piece of history, which I got the Museum of Modern Art to corroborate directly with Joanna, was, of course, my ace in the hole to get one of the existing machines, not a working machine. The lights are basically a hardware duplication in the middle, inside the machine. But I got one of these into the Museum of Modern Art because they said it was not only a technological landmark, but also if you look at the designs that Steve Jobs did before he saw the connection machine and the ones that he did after that, you will see that his design sense went from this sort of cuddly Macintosh aesthetic to the really technological sublime that we now know and expect from all Apple products. So 30 years after the launch of the first machine, I was happy to be able to get one machine into the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. It's been exhibited twice since then. And that's the story of my involvement with all of these parts of our history that have now become incredibly relevant in a way that 30 years ago we certainly hoped for. but could not predict. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much. I think part of what I'm sensing, Tomiko, is, just a desire to absorb the history. And I know from our initial conversations, it's quite historic, what you've shared with us, and it's the evolution of um, that coinage of technological sublime. And I wonder if you might be able to speak a little bit about that technological sublime. How is it defined? What is the form versus function, form and function? Uh, how does that emerge?
Yeah, I found out actually that I didn't originate the term as I thought. I'm blanking now who did, but for me, what it means is, I mean, the word sublime talks about the sense of being part of something that's larger than ourselves, that's usually connected to nature or the universe. I mean, the universe is nature, but we often think of nature as being just this small little layer on the earth with oxygen and water and plants where we can live. But this connection to the entire universe is also a connection to the sublime. And I think certainly with a connection machine, uh, you know, Danny explicitly said it shouldn't be taller than us. It should be my height or smaller. He explicitly said your height or smaller, because you're shorter than most generic white American males who in those days were writing the checks for supercomputers. And so if they come in and see a machine that's smaller than them, they'll feel like this could be part of our family. This is not an overlord who's threatening us. And this is very much then the way that the scientists, Danny and the other scientists at Thinking Machine, thought of AI as a tool that would help us become more than ourselves, have a connection to nature, to the universe, to technology that extends our capabilities as human beings. So for me, that's what I mean by sublime. But you see that also then in the Apple designs that Jobs brought out after that, where you look at this object and you say, somehow, if I can possess and use that object, then that object will extend my capabilities. It will enable me to be more than I am without it. I mean, basically, at this point, we are all, unless we go completely off the grid, we are all forms of cyborgs. And I was very conscious as an 8-year-old when I got my first pair of glasses that all of a sudden I could see the chalkboard. I could see people across the street. And I realized this is what normal people can see, but I needed a piece of technology in order to do that. So I knew from the age of 8 on that my existence as a cyborg was going to be much better than my existence as a pure human being. And I think that's what we engineers and the scientists and the technologically um, oriented feel happens when you use a good piece of technology. And then the question is, just as nuclear power, the splitting of the atom, can bring benefits, it can also bring vast destruction. And take a look at the difficulty that we have had since the atomic bomb was first invented at being able to control nuclear technology and try to use it for good rather than for destruction. And it's that sort of effort on a worldwide scale that we need to do with AI technology, because if only one company says we will restrict ourselves, we will stop our innovation, we'll stop trying to push our technology, they'll go bankrupt, and other companies will do exactly what they would have done, and we'll be no better off. And that's why the AI CEOs are saying we need to have this pressure from the outside. It can't be one company going it alone. It has to be everyone working together and saying, just like with nuclear energy, this is how we're limiting it. And I sure hope we can continue to limit nuclear technology for good and not for evil. But, we are now more nervous than we ever have been in a long time. So I think those are the challenges that we are facing right now as humanity.
Absolutely. There's so much in there. I think it sparked, 20 follow-up questions that
Yeah.
I've started jotting down. And I think, let's start with where you left off. And part of the impetus for HoloArt is really looking at the pace with which technology is advancing, potentially the pace with which art is changing, and how we might be able to steer collective dialogue toward topics of great importance to humanity, as we essentially, um, more further and further down the ratio of cyborgianism. And so I wonder, when we start speaking about, moral imperatives and
Mhm.
ethics and, good piece of tech, pending perspective, moral relativism aside, how do we label something good or bad and move beyond that duality, given 2 points. One being that, it's historical context. Something may be good at some point and then turn into something not so good. And then the other part being the funding coming from sources
Right.
that, are inherently made for defense, and defense being part of that destruction. How do we build?
Yeah. So again, back to the question of how have we managed to make sure that the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki was the last one until now. I'm half Japanese, I'm half German. My family has been in the country for 3 generations, so no direct relatives of mine um, fought in those armies. But I'm sure glad that the U.S. was able to defeat Germany and was able to defeat Japan, because I wouldn't want to have lived in the world that would have been resulted otherwise. So I can't be a pacifist, because I know that neither Hitler nor Tojo would have stopped at some point and said, "Okay, I'll let the rest of you just live in peace and do whatever you want. I've gotten enough." There was never enough. So so we need that same sort of scale and that same sort of urgency, not just for AI, but also for climate change. And certainly at climate change, we're failing miserably, because the money from the fossil fuel industries is just so strong that it is basically making people who could turn off the tap are still funding fossil fuels because they're getting a cut. And they don't care, apparently, that the world that their kids inherit will be a horrible, horrible version of the sort of calamities that are coming to us yearly now. So I think we need a worldwide movement and pressure saying, um, we've got to save our Earth. We've got to change our imperatives. We have to expose the people who are profiting from destroying the world, and that will apply to climate. That will apply to military technology. I mean, I'm sure glad that military technology has prevented Kiev so far from absolute destruction, because without that air shield, they would have been flat. I have friends who are still there right now. I want to see those people again. So after World War II, we put basically structures into place that try and get the whole world to work together. And apparently, those structures are still there, but apparently, the hoi polloi, the common people, have to raise their voice even louder because those structures are not being used to really combat the problems that we're facing right now.
Thank you. And there's, the question of ethics in what you're saying and this visioning of impact and consequence. There's so much in what you shared today. I mean, I think I'm just floored by the historics of our dialogue and the relevance to so many urgent matters. What I'd like to do is to kind of unfold and get at that baseline, the original dimension of how do we shift our ethics to, you know, um, quarterly profits, to looking at this as a systemic issue. Here, where I am now in Canada, there are a lot of forest fires. I live in the middle, and so children where we are not allowed out during school time. And this isn't even one of the provinces that is experiencing a fire. And so part of that, I think, connectivity and systems way of viewing, these multidimensional applications for me is looking at, well, air, water, some of those natural resources are quite priceless. They're not factored into the ledger sheet in the
Right.
same way. And so what would be potentially a way for art to introduce that and open a dialogue to make those connections and those linkages, perhaps in a more constructive way than exposure or finger pointing. And so I wondered if you might be able to speak a little to that.
Yeah, I mean, uh, there are a lot of artworks that are addressing these problems, and it's very easy to make sort of doomsday um, dystopian works. And certainly in around 2015 or so, as I first became aware that the um, the climate shifts were not linear; they were exponential, which meant instead of you know happening off in 2100 or so when I'm long dead, they were going to be happening in my lifetime, and they're happening. Now I think we're going to be hitting 1.5 degrees Celsius warming within the next couple of years because we're already mostly there. So, so so one part is I think is very, very vital that especially people who live in clean countries or countries that are not being directly affected, if you're not being affected by flooding, if you're not being affected by wildfire, if you're not being affected by missiles landing on your head, if you're not being affected by the threat of a nuclear power plant blowing up or being blown up, um, then uh, then it's easy to ignore. So I think art has, on the one hand, the possibility of creating experiences that create an emotional bond to these issues. And we know at this point that if you have an emotional relationship to a topic, you are much more likely to remember it, to think about it, and to act on it. So that a role of art is very important to create these emotional ties to these topics by putting a visitor or a viewer or a user through experiences that they might not have otherwise because they can avoid them by staying in their beautiful bubble. And then the other part of that, which I became more and more conscious of as I realized that, when I have give talks to university students, of course, all of these young people know that we older people are destroying their world. They know that they will maybe never, ski in their life, maybe never see a coral reef in their life. Um, Maybe never have a stable home in their life because they have to constantly move to get out of the way of forest fires and floods. So when I had the commission from the Smithsonian, this was, as you mentioned, it was for the 175th anniversary of the Smithsonian, but the name of the exhibit was Futures. And Ashley Molise, the curator, said, imagine the future you want, not the future you fear. And for me, that was really a key phrase to say, okay, at some level, it's easy to make dystopian. It's much harder to make forward-looking, forward-thinking, positively forward-thinking artworks or design or articles. So that was a challenge to me. And the piece that I did for the Smithsonian is called Rewild AR, looking at the concept of rewilding a city, because we now know that we have to return about 30% of the entire world to nature, at least that much, in order to have a sustainable Earth, a sustainable worldwide ecosystem. So, looking at issues of can we turn every available surface from concrete or a roof into a patch of a wild ecology, so that instead of killing off the insects as we're doing and killing off the um, the birds and the animals as we're doing, that we actually create ecologies, that we make our cities permeable to nature, so nature doesn't have to stop at the outside, and that we also think about reducing the amount of agricultural land, because, for instance, the Amazon is I think the Amazon might have already started becoming a carbon source rather than a carbon sink, because the rainforest is being destroyed to turn it into agricultural land, to either plant soybeans to feed to cattle, or to create grasslands for cattle to live on. So can we as artists, can we as designers look at things that are part of the solution, and emphasize those to give people a hope, to give people a direction where they can divert their energy. And then for me personally, frankly, I think a lot of it is political. So I support the last generation. I support the Extinction Rebellion. I support the Sunrise Movement. I don't like it when the last generation, glues themselves to paintings. I think they should, here in Munich, they glue themselves to the pavement, and guess what? That blocks the people driving cars in a city that has a wonderful public transportation system. So I have some quibbles with some of their methods, but hey, they're telling us we want to have a world worth living in, and when you die, we're still going to be here. So we don't really care about your sensibilities. We're worried about having an Earth that we can live on. So I think those are all sort of components that are ways that we can agitate within that space. And it's always, art is, for me at least, always about creating an emotional relationship to concepts, images, ideas, feelings, um, entire
Sure,
ecosystems.
absolutely. I wanted to pick up on what you're saying here because it's related to the medium
Yeah.
and how the medium and the systems and the technologies that we're designing. And you alluded to rewilding and the solar punk movement and, envisioning the futures that we desire. What's the best possible where we can drive ourselves toward imaginations of hope and prosperity and thriving. Um, how can we reconcile that with our current marketing ecosystems? And I know this, from experience with neural marketing and biohacking and this idea of losing ourselves in reality
Mhm.
with the coming of virtual reality,
Uh-huh.
with this trend towards cyborgianism and
Uh-huh.
brain computer interface, future bionics, these
Uh-huh.
exoskeletons. You spoke about that emotional connection. So where do we start veering off from Homo sapien to Homo digitalis, Homo numericus, Homo
Oh,
interpreter?
we've already done it. I would say that we did it when we figured out how to keep fire going, because that's the point when we started burning fossil fuels. So I think Homo sapiens, as we consider it, is naturally a cyborg. And then the question is, is it possible uh, to to find ways of creating energy, solar energy, wind energy. These are all tend to be small scale solutions that work better when it's like individual houses or small groups. And that means that it's hard for large companies who are, trying to make a large amount of profit to give large dividends to their shareholders. So that's obviously, and there's a very obvious split that's been happening where, middle class and poor people have lost money and purchasing power, and then the upper rich levels have been getting more and more. So the aftermath of World War II was also, all of these people have fought in the world wars and have put their lives on the line to try and preserve our country. So let's give something back to them, the GI Bill. Let's give them the ability to have a better life, because you know, they lost limbs for that dream. Their loved ones died for that dream. They might have died for that dream. So that sort of thinking, that that the uh, that I, as an individual, will have a better life when the people around me have a better life. That's what we have to emphasize. And that means coming away from as long as I can create my own little bubble, I'll be fine. Because guess
Sure.
what? The wildfires don't give a damn about your bubble, and neither do
Well,
the floods.
that's just it. And so, when we speak about the sailing and the skiing and the golfing and the, jet setting, I think we're both immersed in worlds where we have access to, you know, different levels of livelihood. And I think part of the movement right now is looking at how people are thinking about insulating themselves in bunkers or, remote islands. And
Right.
I think that type of linearity in terms of logic lends itself to a need toward enlightened entanglement. And that
Mhm.
enlightened entanglement to me is, elevating the realm of consciousness to include an ecological perspective of
Mhm.
not
Mhm.
just a person, but the
Not just
entire ecosystem.
my garden or my estate, but
That's right.
you know, when my estate goes underwater because of rising sea levels, then it doesn't help me.
So I wonder, part of what we're trying to do here with HoloArt is to lift and provide engaging education, entertainment, artistic practice. When I think about the dilution of art for young people
Mm.
today and the separation of emotional connection to both community, the self, our digital identities, I see a need for us to address these topics a few years ahead of their times in ways other than mainstream cinema or
Yeah.
script. And so I know you're doing some work in um, whatever you'd like to share in terms of the work you're engaged in now.
Yeah, so I have another piece that's similar to Wildar called Waldwandel Forest Flux, that's being shown here in Munich. That's also looking at that was a commission from the Bavarian State Forestries to say, okay, what are the trees that are dying out because of climate change, and what are the trees that we need to plant now because they'll be able to create a better ecology and be able to deal with the changes that our climate is going through. And so that piece takes the spruce tree as an example, that has been planted in monoculture, where it's really just, there's maybe a little bit of ground cover that somehow manages to grow. But otherwise, you've just got rows and columns of one type of tree because that makes it easy to harvest. And that type of spruce tree also grows very quickly, but it has incredibly shallow roots. The roots don't grow down, they grow out. And I think in part of Germany, I read that 2/3 of those spruce forests are now dead. They're already dead. And so they're looking at planting a mixed ecology, not a monoculture, but a mixed culture of different types of trees. And for this piece, Forest Flux, then we have what's called a wild service tree. It actually doesn't exist in North America, but it is native to Europe and to Britain. And this is the most valuable hardwood that exists in Europe. But it takes longer to grow. Instead of 60 years, it takes 100 years to mature. On the other hand, during those 100 years, it has flowers that are providing sustenance for the pollinators. It has fruits that provide sustenance for insects, for birds, for mammals. So 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 I'm taking people through an experience of the spruce trees that are familiar dying out, but then being replaced by this really beautiful tree that will do just fine with the drier and the warmer climate here, and will create a whole ecology by itself, as opposed to the monoculture of the spruce tree. And then I have other works that deal with plastics because in 2013 or so, I was in Southeast Asia on a sailing trip, and they took us to this one island which was totally deserted, nobody living there, no animals living there, and it was covered with plastic waste. And then lo and behold, a lot of the labels were not from, Malaysia or Indonesia, which were the countries right there in the area, but actually from Europe or from the US or from Japan. And that's the point where I realized that lots of times when we say recycle, 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 what they're doing with the plastics is, for one thing, less than 30%, maybe much, much less, can actually be recycled. And what recycling means is we will remove it from your clean environment and send it to some other country where we don't care what they do with it because it's out of our sight, it's out of our mind. So I have a lot of pieces that take this plastic garbage and surrounds you with it. And when you interact with it, this plastic garbage expands into corals that sort of plastic garbage corals that trap you in that. So I'm trying to say you might live here in a clean country, but guess what? In the oceans, you're creating an environment where all of the sea dwellers, the fish, and all of the other ocean dwellers are being surrounded by plastic. That's becoming their world because there's now starting to be more plastic than there is biomass. So those are all ways of trying to. I try and engage the sort of selfie culture. I like to do augmented reality, where I have an AR live stream going from sort of a hidden smartphone, and then it's visible in a large projection or in a large monitor. So when you walk into that space, you immediately see yourself in this environment. And then, then of course, people like whip out their phones. Um, and I try and also construct things so that when people do make photographs and share them, then they say, well, this place is called Entering the Plasticine, and these beautiful shapes around me are virtual plastic waste corals. So whether or not they're actually conscious of that, they are spreading that message out by listing the title, by describing the work, and by sharing those photos. So this is sort of my my viral social media strategy for engaging things, to try and create really shareable images that people will like to really post and comment on and share on their own social media.
Thank you. That's incredible to conceptualize and visualize and partake in. And so there's different layers. It's almost like a cube, that could be exponentially. And so that's right.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and and it brings me to think about the nature, pun intended, the nature, the changing nature of our narcissism.
Mm.
And by narcissism, I'm talking about this fascination of self-reflection in
Uh,
videos and selfies and social media. That emotional foci that we had is shifting toward the self, and then it becomes this, instead of an ever expanding dimensionality, it becomes a little bit more restricted. And so, uh, in AR and VR, it becomes even more so. So we're creating essentially reality bubbles. And part of my challenge, I think, has been, and I don't know if this echoes your experience, is translating some of the topics that we're talking about across disciplines. So,
mm.
in terms of a engineering language or computer science language, artistic language, financial language, and then political, educational, and militaristic, and the list goes on and on and on. I'm not sure if there was a question in there, but I think there was, and I'll stop here, and I'm sure you have thoughts.
Yeah, well, that was one thing that made me realize that yes, the design for the connection machine was very successful. That engineers, scientists, AI researchers, when they saw the machine, they had the feeling, yes, this is what I have always dreamed that AI could be. That it was tapping some sort of collective. I don't even want to say unconsciousness because, like I said, I really consciously went to look at the sort of imagery and talk to all of the AI researchers around me about their dreams. So that was, and then making the design of the machine speaks for itself. So it explained just by looking at it that yes, I've got this hardware structure, but what's important are these thousands of processors, tens of thousands of processors inside that are all working simultaneously, and that is then communicating a concept that would be otherwise very hard to describe if people just say, oh, well, there's all these thousands of processors and they're working together. But if you see it immediately, then you can understand it in a very different way. And I think, for instance, the Lend Me Your Face piece that I created together with my project partner slash P in 2020. There, we take one image of your face, and then within a couple minutes, we project it on the big screen, and you are mouthing the sort of sound bites of politicians or famous people, and from a broad spectrum, from left to right, and so that people would say, can I choose who animates my face? And I'm going, no, you can't. You can't because you really can't. Once your face is out there, it's fair game for everybody. So
Sure.
that sort of public exposure, putting you up on the big screen and you're mouthing something from someone you really don't like, you see yourself saying things that you really don't like, and then also the technology was just became possible to do in 2020. Of course, now it's much better, but it's so perfect that you don't see the glitch. And I think artists are really interested in the glitch because that's when you see the cracks in the system, the cracks in the metaverse, the cracks between the fantasy and the reality, and maybe also the cracks between the positive and the negative. So I think there's lots of talent out there that can make absolutely perfect everything right now, and that's not going to necessarily that in some instances maybe that will communicate to you, but I think artists who are used to looking for the glitch and used to looking for how things fail are really able to communicate a lot better to an audience where the, shall we say, dangers, or where the disjuncture might be found between the dream and the reality, or the
Sure,
dream and the nightmare.
that's so, so beautifully said, and it's poetically visualized. And I think what it is for me, a commentary on deep fakes and this puppeteering of ourselves in a reflected kind of reality. And so, when we think about the philosophy of aesthetics and this notion of, people that the super, the design that you had and the responsiveness and the longevity of, how Google and Apple have been able to tap into a form of simplicity in both function and form. How do you see that evolving now, given that we seem to have outsourced creativity to a sense, to databases and data sets that then, re-scramble potential inputs for new creative, outputs. And we had head of innovation at CERN, Dr. Pablo Garcia Tello, join us and share a standard model of creativity. And that standard model of creativity was, similar to these data sets where we're using the imprints that we have,
Uh-huh.
right?
Yeah.
That we're exposed to. And so as they become more limited, my question is, the philosophy of aesthetics, sacred geometry, these shapes that we have that seem to resonate. How do you see that evolving? Um, Given that, you were at one point one of a few women in the mix, contributing to the design. So how do you see that evolving? It's a convoluted question. You're
Yeah.
welcome to
And
enter at any point. It's
yeah, and I'm actually not sure, the 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 current use of AI to generate many, many images and then selecting them. I mean, at Stanford Product Design, a lot of time, a lot of courses were spent on how do you brainstorm, how do you generate, how do you ideate, how do you generate ideas, how do you come up with different ideas. There's a book that says put your mother on the ceiling, basically ways of transforming your worldview and trying to kick yourself out of the box. And then when I was doing my master's at MIT in that was 81 to 83, I was hanging out a lot at Harvard GSD, where the deconstructivist architects had just come into full flower, and I realized that a lot of what was being called deconstructivist was basically ways to ideate, ways to come up with new designs, ways to come up with new forms, rather than repeating the same forms that we've been using for thousands of years. So I personally see the use of AI to generate new combinations or new images as being just another step like this, where it becomes a problem. I mean, one of my one of my cousins uh, earns most of his money by doing concept art for game designers. So a game designer will come and say, I want to create a game that does this and that and the other. Can you drop some ideas? Well, at this point, his wife, who's a who's a producer in the games industry and is better with words than he is, can actually generate with Midjourney or Dolly, can generate more complicated ideas faster, in just seconds. And he, with the design talent, but not the facility with words, the drawing talent, needs all that time. So that's the real crux where it's going to hit and hit badly. For me personally, I have some large virtual reality pieces that I've always sort of wanted to work further on, but it's a lot of work if you're working individually to create an entire huge virtual world. And so I actually am hoping that I get some time to work with these AI image and video and form generators so that I can start playing around with these older pieces of mine and creating new versions without spending 5 years working on them. So again, it's really it's very different from different perspectives on how you're using it and what you're using it for. And at some level, people who needed to like spew out a whole lot of designs as concept sketches and then go off and make something, they will actually, like me, welcome that use. People whose output was that image or that short video, they will have problems because those individual images or those short videos can be now generated very, very quickly in a way that they can't personally do. So it's a little bit dependent on is this the seed of an idea that gets realized as something else, maybe as a as a 3D sculpture or
Mhm.
something, or is this or is that the end product?
I think I could listen to you for hours. And part of that is I want
Great.
to go down the path of physics and, nested kind of Mandelbrot sets. And I keep coming back to this
Sure.
Escher-esque patterning
Uh-huh.
when you speak about uh, going back to the talk earlier, the cube, right?
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
we spoke about well, you mentioned the Nobel Prize, and I have a friend who's a good advocate, I would say, of the law of dissipative states. So something must,
Uh-huh.
collapse to be and so we look at um, humanity, where we're headed, potential, destruction for
Uh-huh.
reconstruction.
Uh-huh.
In art, we have those patterns emerging. What would be your thoughts of concept art and the role of artists in society? Is there a time where we might see every organization have a chief artist officer? And I'm not a fan of the word chief or officer, but an artist imagineer. So,
Yeah, yeah,
we can
yeah.
maybe close off with that in terms of the role of artists in society.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept. Of course, designers and artists have been saying, "You guys need this. You guys need us" for a long time. Um, and so perhaps if people coming from business school find out that they can be that artist and they don't have to like hire someone else, then they'll start instituting that. So yeah, I could be hopeful that just as in the 80s or so, it was a very word oriented culture, and people said, we've got to get people more interested in images so they can be more visual. And by now we're very visual, and we're not, and, and it's sort of taking over the world. So things do change in that way, and it's images have become more acceptable. And I could hope that if people from biz school can generate interesting images themselves, they might be willing to pay someone else to be an image generator for their company because they see the value of it. Um, doesn't always work that way, but I can be hopeful. I have to run off to a concert, so I have to
Thank you
turn
so much for your
to
time. It was
the
a pleasure. And lots for us to sit with
yeah,
here today.
yeah,
Thank you,
yeah.
Miko.
Thank you for asking and for the wonderful conversation. And yeah, let's keep the conversation going.
Likewise. Thank you.
Okay.